As I said, I'm Dr. Hannah Willey. I'm a lecturer in Greek and Roman history at the Faculty of Classics, and I'm Fellow and Director of Studies in Classics here at Murray Edwards College. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm sure most of you do, but what classics is the study of the ancient Mediterranean, and particularly Greece and Rome, but also the cultures that they came into contact with and interacted with. It's the study of their language and literature, their art and architecture, and their thought, but also of the everyday lives of the people who lived in those societies. Today, I'm going to take you through a topic which brings together various of the elements of the study of the classical world so that we can explore the different insights that sources like philosophical texts and literature and art can provide, but also start to think about the limits of those kinds of sources as sources for thinking about the lived experience of people living in the ancient world, and particularly those not from the literary elite. So today I'm going to be talking to you about slavery and social death. There we go. Okay, so a traditional kind of story about classical Athens that you might be familiar with is that Athens is the birthplace of democracy. And it's a city that promoted freedom, right? Eleutheria, the Greek term for freedom, is an ideal that's still held to be fundamental to society and is kind of attributed to Athens as its sort of founding principle. But alongside this narrative, it's also long been recognized that Athens, for all that it was this paragon of freedom, that it was invested in freedom of thought and freedom of expression, that freedom was inextricably tied up with oppression, and that freedom relied on the oppression of non-citizens. Robin Osborne, who also is based here in Cambridge, in a recent-ish book, sort of neatly encapsulated this idea in the title of one of his chapters, Athens, the City of Freedom and Oppression. But the idea has a much longer history. I've given you there a quote from Moses Finley, another famous Cambridge classicist, who talked about the advance hand in hand of freedom and slavery in the classical Athenian world. So Athens relied on the oppression of non-citizens. It relied on the oppression of women, of foreigners, of subject cities when Athens was the head of an empire. And perhaps most strikingly, and for us today, I think most jarringly, on the oppression of enslaved people. I've given you here on screen some images of that are thought to represent the enslaved from vases from the Greek world. We can see that slaves are sort of characterized by the manner of their labor. So we see them performing physical tasks, and that's why the first figure has been assumed to be a slave. By their physical features, if we look at the third image along, you can see some exaggerated bodily characteristics that are thought to be servile. By their status as sort of less than full adults. So if you look at the second image, you can see a diminutive figure who's been sort of racially characterized, but is also half the size of the individual who stands before him. We get this idea represented linguistically too. In Greek, a slave might be referred to as pais, someone who is perpetually a child and never graduates to adult status. And finally, they might be represented by the availability of their bodies. So in the final image, we have a hetaira, a sort of prostitute at a symposium meeting who performs naked for the amusement of the gathered drinkers. So today, I want to think about slavery in the Greek world, and I want to think about the way that slavery was approached by Greek slaveholders. So to think about those from whom most of our evidence comes, the literary elite, and to think about how they envisioned slavery. At the same time, I want to ask, what sort of insights we're able to gain into the lived experience of enslaved people, what room there was for slave agency in the ancient world, and how far we can get at it. And to do that, I'm taking as a launching off point a theory articulated in the late 20th century by a sociologist, Orlando Patterson, in his work, Slavery and Social Death, a comparative study. So what might we mean by social death? Well, here I've given you Vincent Brown's account in his work, Social Death and Political Life in the Study of Slavery from 2009. He talks about Patterson's account, and he says, in Social Death, Patterson recognized the centrality of violence, violation, and dishonor to models of slavery across different societies, and saw slavery as an institution in which slaveholders annihilated people socially by first extracting from them meaningful relationships that defined personal status and belonging, communal memory, and collective aspiration, and then incorporating these socially dead persons into the master's world. So one way to kind of boil that down, to put it simply, would be to think of a slave as someone who is stripped of their prior natal or their born identity, right? They're no longer a father, a brother, a son, a worshipper, a farmer, whatever it might be. They are no longer celebrated for their noble descent or as of pure birth or any of those sorts of things. What they are is a slave. And the only relationship that identifies them and that characterizes them is their relationship to their master, their owner. And in this position, they are inherently without honor, right? Because they don't have access to any of the means of acquiring honor that their natal identity might have offered them. Now, I've given you here a couple of quick sort of caveats. It's not the case that Patterson intended this theory as a way of understanding lived experiences. What he was interested in was understanding the kind of ideal scenario as conceived by slaveholders. So he recognized that in reality, slaves might practice resistance and that we might find indications of slave agency in all of these societies that he was exploring. Rather, the socially dead slave is what the ideal was for the slaveholding society. It was what they aimed at achieving. So it's not that today I'm trying to prove or disprove Patterson's theory. I'm just using it to think with as a model for what we might think is going on in Greek society and how they approached slaveholding. So with this noted, I want to explore how far slavery as social death holds true for our Greek evidence. Is total domination and total alienation the ideal model? And on top of this, how far can we reconstruct the extent to which slaves were able to retain natal identities, so the identities they were born with, or to forge new ones, and to forge new meaningful relationships that defined personal status and belonging? And finally, how did these identities and relationships relate to the master's world? Is it true that the slave's existence was sort of squashed into the world of their masters? Now, if we're looking for ideals in the ancient world, one of the sort of first places we might think to look are the works of the philosophers. Philosophers were often in the business of kind of imagining ideal societies or boiling down the complexities of life to get at the kind of core idea that lay behind lived practice. They wanted to test and identify principles of life and society. So I've got here, to begin with, a passage from Plato's Laws. So for anyone who doesn't know, Plato was a 4th century Athenian philosopher, student of the famous Socrates. And he's still used today to think about justice and virtue and all of these sorts of grand ideas. The Laws, which you've got a passage from here, is thought to be his last dialogue, and it imagines a conversation between 3 individuals, an Athenian stranger, a Cretan, and a Spartan. And they've all come together because the Cretan is part of a colonization sort of mission. They're founding a new colony on Crete, and they're trying to decide how to best plan the laws for this new city. So this is very much a moment for ideals, right? We're asking, if we had a blank slate, how would we arrange society in order to best produce good citizens and good men? So it's interesting for thinking about how we might approach the question of raising, training, all of those sorts of things, enslaved people in such a society. So what we find is that the stranger tells us, we know, of course, that we would all agree that one ought to own slaves that are as docile and good as possible. For in the past, many slaves have proved themselves better in every form of excellence than brothers or sons, and have saved their masters and their goods and their whole houses. Surely we know that this language is used about slaves. Two means only are left for us to try. The one is not to allow the slaves, if they are to tolerate slavery quietly, to be all of the same nation, but, so far as possible, to have them speaking different tongues. And the other is to accord them proper treatment, and that not only for their own sakes, but still more for the sake of ourselves. Okay, so what sort of an ideal type of slave does Plato's Athenian stranger envisage here? And how does he think that that ideal is to be achieved? Well, in some ways, this looks rather a lot like social death. We're told that they shouldn't speak the same language. So this denies them the opportunity both to connect to something, language, which can tie you to your heritage and to your sense of identity, but also to deny them the opportunity to form relationships with others who connect to that same prior heritage, right? If they can't talk to other slaves because they don't speak that same language, they can't form new bonds. Rather, he thinks that they should be integrated. Their loyalty will be to their masters and to their masters' homes. And indeed, he says they'll be better than brothers or sons, right? Their only connection will be to this house, and they will, die to defend it. Interestingly here, we do get a conception of slaves as being able to possess honor or to be afforded honor. So within the master's world, Plato's Athenian stranger assumes that slaves can show virtue, arete, and that they should be honored when they do so. In the next bit of this passage that I haven't given you because it's lengthy, he talks about the proper treatment of slaves being not treating them violently, right? We shouldn't be violent towards them or commit hubris against them. Now, hubris is a Greek word for outrage or insolent abuse, and it carries with it the idea that you're treating someone in a way that doesn't befit their station. So it's very interesting to think about hubris as something that can be done to slaves, because if a slave had no honor, then presumably there would be no type of action that could be inappropriate to commit against them. Now, partly, as he says, this is not only for their own sakes, but still more for the sake of ourselves. I think that Plato's interested here in the question of the virtue of his citizen class. So if you are subjecting your slaves to violence, then you are failing a test. You're given an opportunity where you have complete freedom to do whatever you want to someone, and you're acting violently rather than exercising self-control. But at the same time, the fact that he says that it could also be for their own sakes suggests that hubris here isn't only tied up with citizen honor, but imagines that slaves too could enjoy some honor themselves. Okay, so that's Plato. Here's another one. This is a passage from pseudo-Aristotle's Economics. So Aristotle, another 4th century philosopher, also living and teaching in Athens, but not himself a native Athenian. And the reason that this is called pseudo is because most scholars think that this was probably authored not by Aristotle himself, but by one of his students, possibly Theophrastus or someone else who was trained in Aristotle's school. And what does he have to tell us about slaveholding? So in this passage, we read, of property, the first and most indispensable kind is that which is also best and most amenable to housecraft. And this is the human chattel. So chattel, a word for property to distinguish sort of movable property as distinct from land. Our first step, therefore, must be to procure good slaves. Of slaves, there are two kinds, those in positions of trust and the labourers. And since it is a matter of experience that the character of the young can be moulded by training, when we need to charge slaves with tasks befitting the free, we have not only to procure the slaves, but to bring them up for the trust. In our intercourse with slaves, we must neither suffer them to be insolent nor treat them with cruelty. And again, we get the language there of hubris. A share of honour should be given to those who are doing more of a free man's work, an abundance of food to those who are labouring with their hands. We should, moreover, take hostages for our slaves' fidelity by allowing them to beget children, and avoid the practice of purchasing many slaves of the same nationality as men avoid doing in the towns. We should also keep festivals and give treats, more on the slaves' account than on that of the free men, since the free have a fuller share in those enjoyments for the sake of which these institutions exist. So if we're thinking about how similar this text is to the previous one, there are clearly some similarities. We might think of the limit in the previous text on having slaves who speak the same language. And here again, we have the avoidance of purchasing slaves of the same nationality. Again, a way of sort of isolating individuals. And again, we find an interest in honour and in hubris. We might think that it's obvious why you would give food to a brawny enslaved individual so that they can better do their job. But why is it that Aristotle thinks that you should give honour to the sort of slave who you need to be able to trust? We might think that there are kind of levels of a hierarchy of attitudes to slaves found in this passage, and a sort of blurring of the edges between any neat distinction between slaves and free men. So one might be enslaved, but by virtue of performing tasks that are more appropriate for free men or are closer to the sorts of activities that free men can do, then one is able to access a degree of honour. At the same time, we should reward them with the sorts of treats and festivities that religious festivals provide. And those, again, are associated with the free. These are the kinds of things that free people can expect to enjoy in their lives. Again, we see here an attempt to sort of provide everything that the enslaved person needs to encapsulate, to encompass their whole world. So we can think about both physically, right, we provide their food, but also mentally or emotionally. So that there's the idea that an enslaved person might be allowed to have children, but this is only on the gift of the master and is used as a weapon against the enslaved person. So while in Aristotle's conception, or pseudo-Aristotle's conception, a slave can be a mother or a father, they can be a brother, they can be a worshipper, and they can take pride in their job, all of those are not defined by their natal identity, but by what the master has allowed for them to have. So they worship not their own gods, but the master's gods. So in many ways, what we find in the ancient world in our philosophical text does look like it's invested in constructing the same sort of social death for slaves with some tweaks that Orlando Patterson found in other societies. I want now to push kind of at the limits of this sort of evidence to think about what happens when we go beyond the pages of philosophical texts and ask in what ways enslaved people could themselves construct a social existence beyond their masters' homes, and how far Greek societies, particularly Athens, but more broadly too, were invested in actually living up to the sorts of ideals, the sorts of models that we find in these philosophical texts. Um, I've given you here an extract from a speech which is preserved in the corpus of another 4th century Athenian, this time the orator Demosthenes. And here we find something that looks rather in keeping with the model set out by pseudo-Aristotle. What we have here is a story about a manumitted slave, so a slave who has been granted her freedom by her former master. She is an elderly woman who had previously been the nurse of the speaker. He tells the jurors, the speaker, who is usually referred to as the trierarch because we don't know his name, but that was an office that he filled. He tells the jurors that she was a devoted soul and a faithful one who had been set free by my father. He says after she had been given her freedom, she lived with her husband, but after his death, when she herself was an old woman and there was nobody to care for her, she came back to me. I could not suffer my old nurse or the slave who had tended me as a boy to live in want. At the same time, I was about to set sail as trierarch, so commander of an Athenian warship, and it was my wife's wish that I should leave such a person to live in the house with her. While he's away, very nasty people on his account turn up at his house looking to recoup a debt, so to seize property to make up for money that he owes them. And they begin seizing furniture. And this elderly woman, this former nurse, hides a precious item upon her person in order to sort of keep it for her former master. It's a cup. And these wicked men seize it from her and are so rough with her that she is injured and subsequently dies from her injuries. So what kind of story do we find here? Is this former nurse the sort of ideal slave that Plato and Aristotle, or pseudo-Aristotle, were looking for, the sort of slave that we can put faith into? What kind of social existence does this woman have? What we find is a woman who's loyal and willing to die for her master. She's been rewarded with her freedom and been allowed to marry. But what we see at the end of her life is the kind of vulnerability of her position. On her husband's death, she has no one else to go to. She has no one to turn to apart from her ex-master. So this is not someone with an extensive network of sort of protectors and a community who could rally around this widow. It's interesting that the speaker here casts his relationship with the ex-nurse in very affectionate terms, right? We might note again the kind of hierarchy of types of enslaved person that we found in the pseudo-Aristotle text. So he emphasizes the fact that this woman was his nurse and his childhood companion. So we might think of this as promoting a type of closeness, a type of affection that you're not going to find between mine slaves who were owned in vast numbers by sort of absentee masters. If you look at the end of the passage, you can find the same sort of far more dismissive attitude to slavery being expressed even within this same text. So although the nurse is a devoted soul and a faithful one, as he's listing the property that was available to pay off his debt, he says, you have the 50 sheep, the serving boy, and the shepherd, whose value is in excess of the amount of your judgment. Right, so here the enslaved individuals are very much items of property reeled off in a list along with inanimate objects. More cynically, so we might think what we find here is a kind of hierarchy where some slaves provoke affectionate feelings amongst their masters and others are lower down on a scale and thought of more like chattel, more like property. But if we adopt a more kind of cynical lens, then we might worry that the situation here is rather bleaker. right? One could, in a more disinterested fashion, if one wasn't trying to persuade a jury to vote in your favor and to cast your opponents as these wicked and heartless individuals, think that here we have a woman who's been granted her slavery, but has been so conditioned and so limited in the life that is available to her that on the death of her husband, she's returned into service, right? She's still working for her master, still giving everything for her former master. So on this kind of picture, we might think that a social life constructed very much within the master's world sort of works rather comfortably, works rather well for thinking about, for comparison with Patterson's model. If we look beyond the master's home, we find some sort of tantalizing hints that there were opportunities for the construction of an identity outside those sort of offered by the master and his oikos. Now, my research focuses primarily on religion, particularly the religion of the Greeks. And so it's on religion that I'm going to focus today. So to think about how relationships with the gods might have formed a part of a slave's lived experience in the classical Greek world. So how far were slaves able to forge and sustain relationships with the gods that went beyond participation in domestic cults, in the cults of their masters, in the way that we might read that pseudo-Aristotle passage? What you've got here are a couple of texts from the Oracle of Zeus at Dodona. At this sanctuary, people went and asked questions of the god that were inscribed on small metal tablets, and then an answer was returned in the same fashion, something written on the tablet. And occasionally, we're lucky enough to have both, right? We can see both the question that was asked and the answer that the god gave. Now, these are interesting for our purposes because a series of them seem to derive from slave inquirers asking about their freedom. In the first of these two, the individual asks about acquiring his freedom and whether he will gain paramone from his master. So paramone was a legal relationship of obligation. After someone was freed, they still owed certain obligations to their master. So here we have an enslaved person asking whether he will receive freedom through the kind of standard, appropriate to the master's society way of achieving freedom, right? He wants to know whether his hard work will be rewarded. In the second one, similarly, will Kitos get the freedom from Dionysius that Dionysius promised him? So here we can see that kind of hold that masters might have over their slaves, where freedom is dangled as a carrot before them, and Kitos is anxious about whether the promise will be fulfilled. A further two are less explicit, but have plausibly also been thought about in relationship to slavery and the search for freedom. So here we find individuals asking whether or not they should run away, whether Luca would do better if she stays put, and what will happen to me if I leave, shall I make it happen? In both of these cases, we might imagine another scenario where a woman is asking whether or not to remain in a relationship or to stay in a particular position of subservience to a man. Either way, these are interesting for showing individuals who are the kind of objects of the oppressive society that we talked about, seeking divine guidance on their condition and the situation they find themselves in. Now, the interest in all of these texts for us is their independence from the master. You can't imagine a situation where the individual that they're asking whether they should run away from or whether they will get their freedom from is sanctioning these kinds of questions. So they might suggest that this is a situation where no no mortals can help you, right? You may not have a social network of individuals that you can turn to for help among the living, among humans, but where you can turn to the gods as a source of guidance. Now, we might think that is interesting for thinking about enslaved relationships, but before we get sort of too carried away, if you look at number 4, where we do have an answer, if indeed these do relate to one another, as they're thought to do, the answer is the woman should stay put, right? So rather than this being a kind of, if this is a plea for help, the god is acting as a conservative force. A similar kind of recourse to the gods might be provided via cursing. So curses were inscribed on lead and buried in the ground, and we find them from all over the Greek world from the 7th century onwards. And what they do is they request divine aid, or they demand divine aid in binding or otherwise hindering someone who is felt to be a threat to the individual who is cursing them. It's difficult to identify slaves in curses, since cursers rarely identify themselves, right? There's a bit of an anxiety that the curse might rebound on yourself if your name is on it, or that you might be discovered if the curse is ever dug up and seen. But in this example that I've given you, we find enslaved individuals among those listed as potential sources of curses against the cursor in this case. So he's worried that someone has bound him, whether some man or woman or slave or free man or foreigner or citizen, belonging to my household or belonging to some other household, out of envy of my work or works. And he requests that Hermes Chthonios, or Hermes the grasper, or Hermes the trickster, if they have bound him, that he can bind his enemies in return. So here again, we see slaves envisioned as independent religious agents, capable of entering into relationships with the gods that could affect negatively free individuals, even their own masters. Now, if in the Dodona example, we find the oracle kind of towing a conservative line and telling the woman, whether slave or free, to stay put, this text from the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus is really tantalizing for pointing potentially in an alternative direction. What you've got here is an extract from the Yamata, the so-called healing texts from Epidaurus, that lists the miraculous healings that the god Asclepius and his father Apollo performed at the sanctuary there. They were displayed, these texts were inscribed in the 4th century, and they were inscribed and displayed very prominently for any pilgrims who came to the sanctuary looking for healing from the god. We get all kinds of different cases, but in the example that I've given you here, we encounter 2 individuals who are said to have grammata on their foreheads, also described as stigmata. So literally markings or grammata, letters inscribed on their foreheads. In the first case of Pandarus, the Thessalian, the god Asclepius dutifully removes the stigmata, the grammata, from his forehead. But his friend Echidorus, in the second example, because he tries to trick the god and steal the money, the gift that Pandarus was bringing for him, the god gives him his just rewards, and he ends up with 2 sets of markings on his forehead. So he's twice as afflicted at the end as he was to begin with. Now, because of their foreign names and the association of tattooing with slavery in the Greek world, it's sometimes thought that these might represent freed or runaway slaves who had been previously marked by former masters. Tattoos were a common way of identifying slaves in imagery from the ancient world. You see here examples of tattooed slaves performing a role as a wet nurse and gathering water from a well. And we also have evidence that sometimes tattooing could be used as a form of punishment of slaves, so tattooing or branding. So you've got a passage here from the 3rd century author Herodas, one of his mimes, where he talks about, where he has one of his characters talk about using needles and ink to bespeckle a offending person. He says, "Do not vex me at all, or I shall rush out of the house. Am I to excuse this? No, by the Queen, since though human, he does not know himself, he will soon know when he has this inscription on his forehead." So this is all the evidence that might lead us to think that the case of Pandarus and Epidaurus at Epidaurus might be dealing with slaves who've been punished for a former crime. Now, if that's the case, then this is a really remarkable document because it shows the god literally removing the stigma that would prevent these individuals from sort of assimilating within society, right? If you're a former slave and you're literally branded on your forehead, you're never going to be able to get work, to make relationships without that stigma following you everywhere. So here we have a god who's not interested in the relationship between the worshipper and his former master or societal rules. He's only interested in the relationship between the worshipper and himself as God, right? If you break the god's rules, you'll be punished, but social norms and the sort of upholding of a slave society don't seem to be on the god's radar. And that's something that this sanctuary is keen to advertise in this document. A final way that we might think that religion provides the opportunity for the construction of social relationships independent of one's master was in sort of cult settings where religious associations beyond the oikos formed, and slaves may have joined those or joined with free individuals in those societies. Here we have an inscription from a so-called friendly society from the Laurion district of Attica. Laurion is where the silver mines were in Attica, so it's an area where there was a huge concentration of slaves engaged in mining. Laurion is an area where you could not follow the kind of Platonic, pseudo-Aristotelian model of keeping slaves separated from those with the same language or place of origin. There were very large numbers of slaves from Greece's northern neighbors, mountainous regions like Thrace, where they would have acquired skills, most likely, and were therefore a suitable source of mine slaves. In these kinds of epigraphic evidence that attest to these religious associations, we get offerings to Greek gods, like here, Heracles, but also to foreign deities conceived as Phrygian or Thracian. A particularly striking example is the goddess Bendis, who is a sort of quote-unquote foreign deity who is worshipped in the heart of Athens. And her cult is introduced into the city in the 5th century. Her festival is sort of ramped up in the course of the Peloponnesian War, and that provides the opening for Plato's Republic, a famous passage about going to the Piraeus to see the new festival for the god. In this 3rd century inscription, which looks back on the 5th century introduction of Bendis to Athens, the thing that I want to pull out for you is the idea of the unity of the Thracian people. So we read here in the bold section that the Athenian people has granted to the Thracians alone among all foreign peoples the right to acquire land and found a sanctuary. We're told that the whole Thracian people, being of one mind, engaged in this, and that the cult was practiced in accordance with the traditions of the Thracians and the laws of the city. So the reason that this is interesting is it brings us back to that kind of question of how far we can identify modes of enslaved people forming relationships outside their masters' homes and forming a sense of identity separate from their masters. So those slaves are difficult to identify, as I said, with reference to curses in epigraphic evidence. People don't tend to identify themselves as a slave in personal pieces of writing. We know that there are foreigners who are engaged in the worship of these deities. So Daos is a name traditionally ascribed to Thracians, and here he is victorious in the torch race and dedicated this offering to Bendis. Now, it's very possible that Daos is a freed person or a free person from Thrace who has brought into the area for his expertise in mining. But the reason that this is interesting, even if it can't itself provide evidence for slave worshippers, is that with these texts, with this cult being so publicly inscribed into the heart of Athens, this cult of Bendis, and the celebration of a Thracian deity being worshipped by all the Thracian people, we have here a Thracian identity, albeit an imagined one, right? A sort of Athenian model of what it is to be Thracian being celebrated in Athens. And it's hard to imagine that a Mr. Thrace or a Miss Thrace, Thrix and Thriter being names that the Athenians commonly gave to their slaves as indicating a Thracian origin, wouldn't have seen this as an opportunity to think of themselves as part of something other than the oikos of their master. So what then do we end up with? I think that what we see is that at the level of the polis or the level of a sanctuary, we might find individuals with rather different concerns than those paraded in the philosophical texts of a Plato or a pseudo-Aristotle. And that those might have provided opportunities for slave agency and the formation of identities beyond the kind of social death that those texts might have aimed at, that may not have been aimed at by the city or by the sanctuary, but weren't prevented either. I hope what this talk has given you is a kind of insight into the way that social history works in the study of the ancient world, the sorts of approach we have to take. We take evidence of all different types, and we work very hard to work out the sorts of questions that you have to ask of different sorts of evidence. And we use that evidence to kind of reconstruct a world that is much more messy than some of the preconceptions that I think people bring to the ancient world. Preconceptions that derive from a sort of too simplistic reading of some of the great works of literature that survive from Greece and Rome. So that this is a world of oppression as well as of freedom, and we can see that from those texts. But it's also a world of Thrixes and Daoses, as well as a world of Plato's and Aristotle's. And it's that kind of messy, complicated, real world that we're interested in studying in classics degrees at Cambridge and elsewhere. And I will leave it there. So thank you very much for your attention. So many. It's a very kind of wide-ranging degree. It requires a lot of different skill sets, and employers really respond to that. There's an attitude that classicists are great analytical thinkers. They're also good at close reading and precision work, but they're also good at thinking about the big picture, because you have to do all of that to do a classics degree. So, you know, we have the obvious sort of career progression into teaching or further study, but we also have lots of people who go into law, lots of people who go into finance, kind of these, you know, graduate pathways, but also all sorts of interesting things. I ran an event in the faculty when I was EDI lead, where we had former graduates come back. We had someone working for NASA, someone working for a hedge fund. It's mind-boggling, the things that people have gone on to. So you can see some of the stories up on our website. So I do encourage you to look at it, but it's definitely a degree that really does prepare you for employment. We have really great statistics for that. The way that Cambridge Classics works, so Mary mentioned that we have 2 degrees. Those who come with Latin A-level join the 3-year degree, and those who are new to the languages or have some experience but haven't studied it to A-level do a 4-year version of the degree. And what that first year does is it gets you up to a level of Latin that is comparable, if not exceeding, Latin A-level. Now, the reason we do that is because it provides you access to the ancient world that isn't mediated through me or through anyone else. But that said, it takes time to acquire ancient languages, and there are lots of elements of the degree that don't engage in that sort of close reading of Greek and Latin texts. So I'm a historian, and we offer lots of our papers in classics to historians who have no Greek and Latin, and they read texts in translation. Similarly, art and architecture, archaeology, and philosophy, those are all things that some of those papers are done without reading the texts untranslated. So it's a mixture. It's not always practical to read everything in the Greek and Latin because it would take too long. So we do read lots of things in translation too. So in the first 2 years, there is a focus on getting your Greek and Latin to a high standard. But the way that we teach Greek and Latin in Cambridge and the way that we do everything else is very much focused on a cultural approach to the ancient world. So even when you're learning Greek and Latin, you're doing it by studying texts like Homer's Odyssey or Virgil's Aeneid or bits and pieces from the orators to think about sexual assault in the ancient world. We try to contextualize so that it's not just the language for the language's sake, but for accessing that culture. Yes, but we do respond to individual requirements. So you would apply for the 4-year course, but if it was felt that your Latin was strong enough and you wanted to join the 3-year, that would be a conversation that you could have with our LTOs, our language teaching officers in the faculty. Yeah, so this is an idea that, again, has cross-cultural application, right? We can think of boy, right, as a very offensive and sort of degrading way of referring to someone. It's the idea that you don't reach kind of the full potential of an adult male, right? You remain in limbo. And there are various ways, of course, you know, they can see before them that this is a grown man, not a child, but the fact that they choose visually to represent them and linguistically to use that kind of terminology shows the sort of mental gymnastics that I think were going on. This is a really fascinating question, and it's a really difficult one to answer because we often have so little information about the person inquiring. So people have studied the geographical origin of those in the Yamata, as well as those at Dodona where it's possible to do so. And it's certainly the case that if a shrine is local to you, you are going to be more likely to go. So we might imagine that as a scenario. But it may be that they went with their master and, you know, while their master was sending them off to fetch something, they seized the opportunity, right? Or it might be that their masters were happy for them to ask and didn't know what they were asking. I think it's difficult to imagine that they'd okayed these questions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't know that they were engaged in worship. There's an interesting case at Eleusis, the mysteries at Eleusis, where slaves could be initiated. And part of that was practical because the mysteries that were performed there were secret. And so the slaves who worked there had to be initiated or they'd be non-initiates who were seeing what went on. But we hear of prostitutes being paid for by their lovers to be initiated as a sort of gift or benefaction. So there are all different types of enslaved people, and they're in all different types of relationships with free people. So the kind of possibilities are not quite endless, but are manifold, I think. Or multiple, sorry. Those are great questions. I think that, again, the answer is probably variety. That some servile occupations will have been hugely dehumanizing, and in some sort of areas of life, you were treated pretty poorly. I mean, being a mine slave will have been a terrible business, and being beaten, all of these kinds of things, by cruel masters will have, I imagine, left you feeling pretty much like you were being treated as dehumanized. The Odyssey is a really interesting test case because we have this sort of violent treatment of the slave girls, and then we have these swineherds and people who are treated as kind of a level up. And it's very powerful to note they're not servants, they're slaves, right? None of these people have freedom in the sense that adult male citizens have, but their experiences will have varied hugely. And the difference between being a male and female enslaved person, I mean, it will have depended on your master, basically. There were roles that were restricted to male or female slaves. So obviously, you can't be a wet nurse if you're a man, and there were more men down in the mines. But things like sexual assault, although they may have been more common against female enslaved people, certainly occurred against male enslaved people too. So it would have been pretty grim if you were in a difficult situation, regardless of your gender. We have a lot of choice. So in the first year, your choice is more restricted. The literature options are set because everybody is trying to kind of work on their languages together, but you get to choose which of the subdisciplines of classics you're interested in. So whether history, philosophy, linguistics, or art and archaeology. And then from the second year, there is a huge amount of choice. So you can choose half papers from all of these different disciplines and kind of make up a degree that suits you. So in history, we have papers on sex and gender in the history subgroup of classics, and inequality in the Greek world, and inequality in the Roman world. And then there are reception papers on the sort of later study, the reception of classics in later societies and in the contemporary world. And there are philosophy papers, and you can choose a mixture of all sorts of different things. And then at part 2, in the final year, you really can do whatever you like. You can borrow a paper from another tripos if you're interested in exploring something that English has to offer or history has to offer. And you can do a dissertation if you'd like, so a topic entirely of your own choosing on which you write 10,000 words. And then you can choose from any of the sort of, I don't know, 15 or so papers, 20 papers that are on offer from the classics faculty for your other papers. So lots of choice. There are different ways of thinking about slavery. So it's very interesting to trace the sorts of attitudes that we found in the philosophers, like approaches in thinkers to slavery from the Greek to the Roman world. And you do get a lot of continuity there. Legally, the situation had similarities, but also differences. So in Rome, the chief difference is that if you're freed in Rome, you attain a form of citizenship. You don't seem to have been able to hold all offices or priesthoods, but your children could. And you weren't just free, but you were a citizen. Whereas in Athens, at least, freed individuals had a status more akin to metics, so foreign free individuals living in Athens. So they were taxed, and they had to have a representative in various contexts. They couldn't hold office, they couldn't vote in the assembly. So that's immediately quite a striking difference. And that does affect the way that Roman authors and thinkers think about slavery, the fact that it's a much more that the blurring between citizen and slave looks very different than it does in the Greek world. And Greek and Roman slavery influence upon and similarities with 16th, 20th century slave trades. Yes, again, intellectually, it's very interesting to look at the way that they looked back to the classical world for justifications and for arguments thinking about slavery. In terms of actual practices, there have been lots of comparative studies done. The appeal for the classicists is that from the American slave trade, and slaveholding society, we have types of evidence that we just don't have for the ancient world. So first-person accounts from slaves is not something from enslaved people, is not something that we have from the ancient world. And that makes it sort of very tantalizing. But to use that kind of evidence, you have to assume that there is something of a universal human response to being enslaved. And I think there, you know, we might want to worry a little bit that the experience of being a slave is in some sense the same, whatever society you're in. You don't need any. So because Greek is not taught very widely in schools, the vast majority of students come without Greek, and they do something called intensive Greek, where you get language support from the faculty, and where you read smaller amounts of Greek than those who come with A-level. Some people have GCSE, some people have done a bit themselves at home, and I would never discourage language learning because it's good for your development as a classicist and also good for the soul. But whatever level you're at, the faculty will meet you, and we stream, and there are different types of exam paper depending on the level that you arrive with. Well, I mean, that would really depend on what sort of area of classical history you're interested in. We've just got a new professor of ancient history in Cambridge, Jo Quinn, and she's written a book on the invention of the West, where she kind of charts the idea of Western civilization and how that kind of imagined concept came to be. So that might be a good place to kind of introduce you to a lot of different questions, and then you could dive in deeper. But do drop me an email if there are particular things that you would like to study. No, you do not. Again, we get lots of students who do class civ, some who do ancient history, but it's absolutely not required. There are no expectations of knowledge. And even if you do classical civilization, I think what we're looking for at A-level is as much, it's not knowledge, right? It's passion for the subject, and where you see that is through your independent engagement with it. So anyone who is taking classical civilization but wanting to study classics at university, do go off syllabus, right? Pursue your interests, go down those rabbit holes, look at areas of the ancient world that appeal to you, because that will show us that you have the kind of commitment that you'll need when you come to spend all your time thinking about the ancient world. It's not all your time, you get to do other things too, but all your academic time doing that. That's a difficult question because the idea of race in the ancient world is kind of complicated. There are discussions about where slaves come from, and in Rome you do get discussion of homegrown slaves and the sort of desirability of being able to train a slave from the get-go. And we do get what you might call racialized thinking in the ancient world, so ethnographies that do ascribe characteristics and both sort of physical and in terms of character traits to different peoples. But it's not, slavery doesn't have the same kind of distinct physical markers that we find in other world slave systems, right? Slaves weren't easy to spot in the ancient world because ethnically they were very similar to, in lots of cases, to the slaveholding population. Yes. So at the moment, we have a part 2 course that involves a trip to Rome on visual narratives for those who are interested in art in the ancient world. And then what we also have are that various members of the faculty, various of my archaeology colleagues are engaged in digging in various places. And so each digging season, students can apply to go and join those digs. And then the other thing we have is that both at Murray Edwards and in the Faculty of Classics, there are funds. So you can apply for funding to pay for individual travel or with your friends to classical locations that will support your studies. So those are people particularly who've never been before, or it's particularly closely tied to their studies, are more likely to have those grants awarded, but there are opportunities out there. And so, yes, not always kind of official trips, but we definitely encourage it. I don't think it's a kind of easy yes or no on that, because different types of pathway in school can bring different types of strength. So, you know, it's wonderful to have Greek and Latin, and where those are available, then I, as I said, wouldn't ever discourage someone from taking them. And Classiv, the advantage of Classiv is that it shows a kind of engagement with the culture that Greek and Latin A-level don't have as much room for. But as I said, I don't think that Classiv is the only route to that kind of engagement, right? And that independent study of literature and history or philosophy, whatever it is that sparks your interest, are great ways to go. So, you know, if you don't have the opportunity to study ancient languages, but you're studying Spanish or German, that's great. Or if you're doing maths and music, it shows an analytical mind, and that's great, right? We don't have a kind of one model of what the ideal classics student needs to be. And that's why the only requirement is for the 3-year degree. You have to already have the languages, and that's just about time rather than acquiring a particular sort of profile. So assignments look like different things for different subjects. We have weekly essays and translations that are set, but there are also different types of option that people do. So we'll have in the first term in our taster sessions, you might go to the cast gallery, do a tour of the cast gallery, choose one of the statues to talk about and to sort of think about with your supervisor. I've seen archaeologists who've treated their office as a dig site, and you're supposed to go in and try and ascertain what you can about the individual who uses that space. So there are kind of inventive ways that people do things. But mostly we have essays and practical criticism, so commentaries on passages, whether literary or historical or whatever it might be. So I think that's all we've got time for, but do drop me an email if you have questions. I'm always happy to answer them. And especially, you know, if you're interested in coming to Cambridge, we would very much welcome your applications.